For motorcycling enthusiasts today, hoping to find a classic British motorcycle of the future, the choice is pretty much limited to the Triumph models, literally resurrected in the latter part of the 20th century by visionary businessman John Bloor. It's a sad indictment of an industry that once boasted as many as 700 motorcycle manufacturers. But it's a tradition that thankfully lives on with the riders and restorers of classic British motorcycles who refuse to let the nation's best loved transport heritage die. Twice in the 20th century, World War halted the progress of motorcycle development, and on both occasions, in 1914 and 1939, the manufacturers turned over their production lines to the war effort. The years between the two world wars proved to be the golden age of the British motorcycle, with innovative new designs launched on a regular basis. Nevertheless, the Wall Street crash and Great Depression that blighted America also hit hard in Britain, and many of the smaller companies disappeared almost without trace. Those that survived grew stronger and more competitive in a marketplace full of enthusiastic motorcyclists ready to put the latest models to the test. This should have been the perfect platform for the British motorcycle industry to build upon for the future, but during the 1950s and 60s, this great legacy was squandered with poor management at a time when Japanese competition was positively overwhelming. Yet this is a celebration of the classic British motorcycle rather than a lament for its passing. So, without further preamble, it's time to take to the open road to enjoy the sights, sounds and thrills of a bygone age. There is something truly magnificent in the lines of a classic Triumph motorcycle. Even the Hollywood film industry favours the Triumph above the homegrown Harley-Davidson, with such heroes as James Dean, Steve McQueen and Marlon Brando all recorded for celluloid posterity riding Triumphs. It's been said in Hollywood that the man who saves the world rides a Triumph motorcycle, and we certainly wouldn't argue with that. Although our riders today, for this programme, would always modestly claim that the motorcycles are the true stars of the show. The story of Triumph has far humbler beginnings and dates back to 1887, when Siegfried Bettmann founded the Triumph Cycle Company in Coventry to manufacture bicycles. With the coming of motorised transport at the turn of the century, Triumph produced their first powered motorcycles in 1902, and by 1905, the factory output reached 500 motorcycles per year. The Triumph reputation grew steadily, and when World War I broke out in 1914, the trusty Triumph was supplied to the Allied forces. Interestingly, Colonel Claude Holbrook, who procured motorcycles for the War Office, later joined Triumph as general manager in 1919. Throughout the 1920s, Triumph enjoyed constant growth, acquiring an automobile division, with cars and motorcycles produced under the same banner until 1935, when the two were split. The storm clouds of war were yet again gathering, and at the outbreak of hostilities in 1939, Triumph once more had a part to play in the nation's defence. During the Second World War, the government took nearly all of the motorcycles manufactured by Triumph, and even when the factory at Coventry was destroyed in the Blitz, output continued from alternative sites at Warwick and then Meriden. The post-war years saw Triumph work its way back into the civilian marketplace, but by 1951 they'd been taken over by BSA motorcycles. However, the Triumph name was retained, and the company remained a separate concern under the BSA umbrella. Triumph faced the threat of new Japanese imports through the 1960s, and by the 1970s, the once hugely successful BSA parent company was facing financial ruin. BSA merged with Norton Villiers, and the new Norton Villiers Triumph was sponsored by the government of the day. But when it was announced that the Triumph plant at Meriden was to close, there was a workers' sit-in that brought production to a halt. Eventually, the Meriden Workers' Cooperative was formed, but despite further government support, the cooperative went into liquidation in 1983. This could have been the end for Triumph, but rescue came in the person of John Blaw, an English property developer, who injected new life into the old classic. Unlike such British motorcycle giants as BSA, Norton, Royal Enfield and Ariel, all consigned in the most part to the history books, Triumph had a future thanks to inspiration and investment. By the 1990s, production was back on track, and today Triumph remains at the forefront of modern motorcycling. Yet there's nothing quite like a touch of nostalgia to thrill and delight. In 1907, just after the turn of a brand new century, with technology advancing in leaps and bounds, Triumph began to be known as true pioneers in the field of motorcycling. This 3.5 horsepower, 500cc machine is acknowledged more than any other model or make built within the same time frame as being hugely influential in the blossoming motorcycle industry. Triumph undoubtedly helped influence the mass acceptance of the motorcycle, which was still looked at with suspicion and fear by the general public before this model. Triumph was quick to exploit the new marketplace and went into production on a grand scale, making motorcycles like the one you see here an aspirational commodity. Of course, it helped a great deal that the popular Isle of Man TT race was won in 1908 by this single-cylinder side-valve motorbike. This boosted the sales of the Triumph Roadster enormously, and a special TT Roadster soon appeared in the trade catalogues of 1909. The continued reliability of these early models off the production line soon led to later models becoming known as trusty Triumphs. This reliability, coupled with a nifty turn of speed, came from some solid engineering work that gained the company a great reputation that they still hold to this day. The belt-driven Roadster had a 3-speed rear hub that was similar to the ones used on the ordinary pedal bicycles. The difference here was that it was fitted with a clutch incorporated into this very hub. A twin-barrel carburettor of Triumph's own design was fitted in 1908, in the year of the Isle of Man TT race win, and a magneto system. As was the case with these early motorised bicycles, the weight of construction was very light indeed, coming in at around £175. The engine was a simple side-valve design, which managed a comfortable 499cc and a top speed of 55 miles per hour, and used a direct belt drive to the rear wheel as mentioned before. The hub gear and clutch made for a much easier life than the alternative fixed gear, which meant a run and bump start after every stop. The Isle of Man TT race was a great advertisement for the continued sales success of the Triumph Roadster 3.5 horsepower model. Not only did this machine win the single-cylinder category in 1908, but it also managed to be placed well in the 1909 and 1910 TT races too. This kept the Triumph name in the public eye, and allowed the sales figures to steadily climb into profitability. In 1911, a motorcyclist called Ivan Hart Davies proved the endurance and reliability of this Triumph Roadster beyond any reasonable doubt. He completed the famous route from Land's End in Cornwall to John O'Groats in Scotland. John O'Groats is the furthest village from Land's End on the British mainland, an end-to-end route with both points separated by 876 miles. The name of John O'Groats derives from Jan de Groot, one of 3 brothers who arrived in the area in 1496, with a commission from King James IV to operate a ferry between the mainland and the remote island of Orkney. The name of Land's End, way down south of John O'Groats, is, to be honest, rather self-explanatory. Ivan Hart Davies, riding his trusty Triumph Roadster, managed this colossal distance in just less than 30 hours, and it was the very last time such a record non-stop run was permitted. This wonderful old Triumph was the flagship of the industry, building on the standard set by the earliest 3 horsepower model, which had been produced for just a 2-year run between 1905 and 1907 before being succeeded by this more advanced machine. The capacity had been increased by over 163cc, and the improvements were all in the detail. The new Roadster ran for a longer period than its immediate predecessor, with an unbroken 7-year run from 1907 through to 1914. It was the machine that set the stamp for the Triumph Engineering Company Limited, and also prepared the public for the sonic sound of the motorcycle boom. The Triumph 100 was the most successful of the medium-range motorbikes that Triumph developed and produced both pre-Second World War and post-Second World War. The 2 examples we have here represent both of those eras in the Triumph Tiger 100's history. The Triumph Tiger was introduced to the general public in 1938, and it created a truly sensational buzz. Previously, it had been used for 12 months as a touring model to help iron out any irregularities and mechanical problems that might have developed. This was a policy thought up by Edward Turner, managing director of Triumph, and also their chief designer. He believed that the sports model should be as close to perfect as it was humanly possible to achieve when it went on general sale, and this inspired thinking put Triumph ahead of the game when it came to any competition. The British press raved about this amazing machine, the public clamoured to buy them, and Triumph had the template of a motorcycle that they'd be building and modifying for the next 3 decades. The first batch of Tiger 100s were just a sportier version of the touring model, with a bigger and stronger cylinder base. This was accompanied by a gas-flowed cylinder head and a compression ratio of 8:1. The forged flat-top pistons had valve cutaways in the crown to accommodate the very impressive 7,000 revs per minute which could be achieved at full throttle. The parallel twin-engine characterised development in the British motorcycle industry from the 1930s right through until the 1960s. Originally, the Triumph Tiger 100 was simply intended for clubman racing, as it was fitted with a detachable silencer that allowed the tailpipe, end cap and baffle to be manually removed by the owner. This gave an amplified roar from the engine, rather like sticking the exhaust next to a megaphone, and was simply to impress other riders and racers. Clubman racing was purely sport-orientated, with riders competing just for the fun of it, rather than for prize money or trophies that may have been on offer by the organising club. It was very popular in the early years of motorcycling on testing tracks when gentlemen racers would pit their strength, agility and handling skills against each other for nothing more than the thrill of the chase. The Tiger 100s were very popular in this field of clubman racing, and the first run of these speedy machines were an instant success for the dedicated enthusiast and the general public alike. After such a grand mass testing at clubman level, Triumph took note of the minor quibbles and suggestions and added a full skirt piston to their existing model. They also decided to add check springs on the stiff girder front fork to allow it more give, and a handy speedometer was placed on the tank that showed the rider a gear-by-gear revs per minute scale. However, it was not long after these additions that the production of the Tiger 100 model metaphorically skidded off the track, hit a safety wall of tyres, and came to an abrupt stop. The popularity of these fast-paced 498cc twins, with their pre-unit construction of separated engine and gearbox, was never in any doubt. But the advent of the horrific and brutal Second World War saw factories and raw materials used in the building of motorbikes turned over to military use. This Tiger 100 model that was produced in the same year as the atrocities of war began would have been a rare sight to see gliding around the countryside, especially once petrol rationing kicked in. It truly was a marvel of modern engineering for the time, and it's easy to see why so many people fell in love with it. When the Second World War came to a close, and VE Day heralded victory for the Allied forces against Nazi Germany in 1945, the British nation were eager to celebrate and get back to the peaceful and prosperous way of life that had been the normal routine of the 1930s. Triumph had already begun production of their post-war range of the Tiger 100 before the celebrations had even begun, in their new factory at Meriden in the West Midlands. They were soon rattling out their own metaphorical Triumph big guns once the real shooting had finally stopped. When the first post-war Tiger 100 models were released for sale to the public at large, there were a lot of subtle differences to these magnificent machines. The pre-war model, as we've just seen, was an entirely different beast. The newer models had telescopic forks rather than stiff girders, and the look and appearance of the crankcase had undergone a major revamp too. This resulted in there now being a separate magneto and dynamo at the front and rear of the motorbike, instead of the earlier Magdyno combined electrics. Although the Tiger we're now looking at is of 1960s vintage, there were further significant developments in the years between these two machines. The big clamour from the motorcycling enthusiasts during peacetime was the need for rear springing to increase the comfort in riding the new Tiger 100. This would have required a major frame redesign, which was out of the financial budget of Triumph at the time, especially after the cutbacks and poor economy of the immediate post-war months. However, they were always mindful to listen to their loyal customer base, and so a large diameter hub, containing its own springing system, was added instead. This was called the sprung hub, and became part of the rigid frame for an extra £20 on the purchase price. This did the trick for the time being, and saved Triumph a fortune in new production costs without shortchanging their customers. The Triumph Tiger 100 ran from the late 1930s until the late 1960s and was beloved by everyone who owned one. It was an unashamedly populist motorbike which appealed across the board. When it roared, you listened. When it purred, you wanted to stroke it. When it bit, it left marks. This was a real tiger of a motorcycle. The Triumph Bonneville is arguably the most famous Triumph ever made. In 1959, the Triumph Bonneville T120 model was produced in response to public demand. At that time, America was Triumph's biggest market, which is no doubt what Edward Turner, the man responsible for naming the bike, had in mind when he called it Bonneville, in honour of Johnny Allen's record-breaking attempts on the famous Utah Salt Flats. The popular Triumph T100 was the design on which the T120 was based, with added twin carburettors, a single-piece camshaft and splayed inlet ports. The demand had been created by performance-minded riders customising their T100s with a twin carburettor conversion, so it was only natural that Triumph would want to get in on the action and actually make these riders buy a new version rather than update an old one. The very first production run of the T120 still bore the same shape and silhouette of the T100, which caused initial problems. The powerful 649cc engine, with a peak output of 46 brake horsepower at 6,500 revs per minute, could achieve an easy 115 miles per hour, and this created too many wobbles and vibrations for the less sturdy chassis of its immediate predecessor. In the 1959 catalogue, there was no Bonneville to be seen, as it had been rushed through production so quickly that the publicity office got caught unawares. However, in the hastily produced brochure and promotional material, Triumph trumpeted their new T120 Bonneville with some pretty high claims. The best motorcycle in the world, they boasted. The Bonneville 120 offers the highest performance available today from a standard production motorcycle, was a brave statement, and Triumph categorically insisted that this is the motorcycle for the really knowledgeable enthusiast who can appreciate and use the power provided. However, despite the Americans being the ones pressurising Triumph to design and produce a twin carburettor 650, the look of the bike was off-putting for the average motorcyclist. The T100's headlamp, heavy mudguards and swept-back touring handlebars, which came as a package with the initial frame, were not particularly sporty looking, and in 1960 they were dropped altogether. The frame was revamped with a twin cradle design and new forks, sportier mudguards, a separate headlamp was added, as was a better saddle. The 1960 T120 Bonneville was the real deal and made the cash registers ring at a respectable £285. In 1971, this great motorcycle was replaced by a larger 750 model, the T140 Bonneville, consigning the T120 to the history books. But this is nevertheless a classic motorcycle that will never be forgotten. The Triumph TR6 Trophy is probably best known for being the motorcycle from the World War II prisoner of war movie The Great Escape. It was the high-flying machine, a 1961 model, that almost allowed famously cool film legend Steve McQueen to avoid recapture after escaping from a prisoner of war camp. In real life, Steve McQueen owned 200 motorbikes, and Triumph was one of his favourite manufacturers. In 1961, Triumph launched the TR6 Trophy, which was an upgrade from the sporty 498cc TR5. Whereas the TR5 was designed primarily for racing, the TR6 had a distinct leaning towards the open road rather than the oval racetrack. Edward Turner, chief designer and managing director of Triumph Engineering Company Limited, had never been happy that the TR5 had been developed, designed and prepared in his absence and without his initial consent. He was a man who was opposed to racing, even though it created so much success for Triumph and helped sell so many motorbikes. So when it came to the TR6 Trophy, he kept a watchful eye on production. Essentially, the TR6 Trophy was almost identical to the popular Triumph Bonneville, but this new bike had a single 30mm carburettor instead. Although the Bonneville outsold this new version, popular opinion amongst classic bike enthusiasts today suggests that the TR6 was actually the better machine. They cite the sleeker and more stylish design, coupled with the low revving flexibility and the cleaner carburation. 2 years later, in 1963, the TR6 Trophy, along with the different engine-sized Triumph Bonnevilles, became a one-unit machine, with the construction of a combined engine and gearbox, instead of them both being separate, and it also received a new coil ignition too. The production of the Triumph TR6 Trophy ran right up until 1983, but by then it had been sadly neutered by a reduction in engine size to 600cc, and these were never as popular. There were many variants of the TR6 during its years in production, but it essentially stayed looking the same. The thick saddle seat joining to the classically shaped fuel tank and the sleek, elegant styling of the exhaust all make this unmistakably a Triumph. As our time enjoying these classic Triumph motorcycles draws to a close, this mark of all the great British classics has the rare distinction of still being in production. There's over 100 years of history behind Triumph as a privately owned British company, and that same philosophy, responsible for the creation of such iconic motorcycles as the Bonneville, Rocket, Thunderbird and Tiger, is still very much alive and well, and manufacturing motorcycles that will become the design classics of the future. The principle is the same as it's always been. with a steady commitment to producing unique motorcycles that are distinctive in looks, design and performance. Whichever model is chosen, a vintage or modern Triumph will deliver a great riding experience through the fusion of a well-balanced, easy-to-handle chassis and strong, flexible engines. Nevertheless, however laudable such principles undoubtedly are, in terms of the British motorcycle industry, this is far from being rocket science. There were many of Triumph's contemporaries who were equally as innovative and produced, some would argue, much better motorcycles. Why then did Triumph survive, while such great names as Norton, Vincent, Royal Enfield, BSA and Ariel fall by the wayside? It's a fascinating question, and to find the answer, we need to look at three major incidents in the 20th century that quite literally changed the world. The First World War, fought between 1914 and 1918, forced the fast-developing motorcycle industry to put any innovations on hold. The armed forces required thousands of motorcycles, and reliability combined with durability was far more important than speed and performance. Manufacturers that rose to the challenge flourished, and the trusty Triumph was no exception. It's interesting to note that before World War I, the Rex was known as the king of motorcycles, and the British company that manufactured them was much larger than Triumph. However, Rex did not secure any military contracts and consequently struggled for survival in the post-war years. Undoubtedly, the years after World War I were the most innovative and successful that the British motorcycle industry would ever know, and Triumph went from strength to strength. But just as the world of commerce was getting back to normal, the Depression hit, and the British motorcycle industry once more faced a drastic fall in sales. Many companies ceased trading, but Triumph, along with the reduced number of motorcycle manufacturers who survived the Depression, forged ahead competitively. Triumph had weathered the storm, and when World War II broke out in 1939, the company once more turned to military contracts for the 5-year duration of the hostilities. Again, it was the motorcycle companies that produced machines for the armed forces that strengthened their positions, and BSA were able to take over Triumph in the early 1950s, due in part to their wartime successes. Ironically, it was Triumph that survived, whilst BSA, along with associated motorcycles, failed to stand the test of time. When Rudyard Kipling spoke of triumph and disaster in the same breath in his great poem If, his words had an appropriate resonance for the Triumph Motorcycle Company. Triumph had stood so close to disaster throughout its more than a century of trading, yet each time it has survived. The motorcycles featured in this programme are a tribute to that endurance, because at the end of the day, with a name like Triumph, perhaps failure is simply not an option. When it comes to British motorcycles, the name of Norton has always been synonymous with performance and style. Like so many British motorcycle manufacturers, the company's roots were firmly established in the bicycle industry and in the Midlands. James Lansdowne Norton of Birmingham began the Norton Manufacturing Company in 1898, making chains and other items for bicycles, the greatest transport innovation of the day. But the need for speed is evidently not a modern phenomenon, because in 1902, The first Norton motorbike was produced when an engine was added to a bicycle frame. It was a revolution indeed, and progress was unstoppable. The advent of motorsport was inspirational to Norton, and when one of his motorcycles, complete with a Peugeot engine, won the first ever TT race on the Isle of Man in 1907, the company expanded into the newly evolving transport marketplace. This is Harrods in London's fashionable Knightsbridge, and if you'd wanted to purchase a Norton motorcycle in 1909, you could have bought one from here. There was a choice of 8 models, but despite the popularity of the new motoring craze, Norton struggled as a business. The man responsible for giving his name to these motorcycles was a very good engineer, but not so skilled as an entrepreneur, and by 1913 the company faced bankruptcy. Fortunately, one of the main creditors stepped in to save the day and formed Norton Motors Limited, allowing manufacturing to continue. Between 1914 and 1918, Norton's factory was kept busy with contracts for World War I, supplying motorcycles for the Russian army, Great Britain's allies. The company needed to move to larger premises in the Aston area of Birmingham, and it was at this time that the now famous Norton logo started to appear. As peace followed the war that was supposed to end all wars, James Norton fulfilled his dream of creating an overhead valve machine. The Model 18 first appeared in 1922 and quickly became established as one of the fastest motorcycles around. These were the golden years of the British motorcycling industry, as racing, whether in the TT on the Isle of Man or the Brooklands Road Special, put every new design to the test. James Norton died in 1925 at the age of 56, but his legacy lived on when a new design with an overhead camshaft helped the company to dominate the racing circuits of Britain and Europe for the next 25 years. However, the war to end all wars proved to have offered false hope. World War II broke out in 1939, and during the 6 years of the conflict, more than 100,000 Nortons were manufactured for military use, as production of the rest of the range was suspended. In the post-war years, such classics as the Dominator and the Commando all added to Norton's credibility, but the 1953 takeover by Associated Motorcycles Limited set a downward trend from which the British motorcycle industry, and inevitably Norton, would never fully recover. But that's quite enough history to be going on with, so let's take a step back in time to Norton's heyday and enjoy a priceless selection of the very best of British bikes. The Norton 16H has been an Isle of Man TT racer, a family transport sidecar holder, and a wartime dispatch rider within its 33-year history. Like the other Norton motorcycles of its era, this machine was stamped with incredible longevity and a proud tradition. The Model 16, as it was originally called, was very similar in design and specifications to the very first Norton ever built, the Big 4, which was a particular favourite of James Lansdowne Norton, the founder of the company. The main difference between the two was the 16H used a smaller engine, but with the same 79mm x 100mm dimensions. The 490cc single-cylinder side-valve 4-stroke engine managed a top speed of around 80 miles per hour with an external valve gear. The Big 4 frame was also used on the 16H, but this had an extraordinarily high clearance from the ground. To distinguish between models, the 16H frame was redesigned to have a lower ground clearance, and this became known as the home model for travelling around England, and this is what the H in its name derived from. Because James Lansdowne Norton had travelled around South Africa on a Big 4 and noted how the roads were different in the outer reaches of the British Empire, the high ground clearance frames came to be known as colonial models for riding abroad. World War I intervened in the production and development of the 16H model, and it wasn't until 1919 that a Norton 490cc engine acquired a chain drive with a 3-speed gearbox. A saddle tank eventually replaced the flat tank of the earlier 16H models in 1929, and the frame went through several carefully designed and up-to-date changes in order to make it more aerodynamic and aesthetically pleasing. During the 1930s, a few more changes took place. These included the change of the position of the exhaust pipe, which switched from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. This was quickly followed by a new 4-speed gearbox, which replaced the 3-speed one, and had been available on other Norton models for a few years previously. Because the 16H was a relatively cheap motorcycle to produce, without the quality, reliability, or assured road handling ability being diminished, it soon caught the eye of the British Army. As the approach of an impending Second World War dominated the whole of the United Kingdom, Norton's factory in Birmingham, deep in the heart of the Midlands, began producing a military version of the Model 16H for possible use in the war. Taking the engine from the 1937 version with an open valve gear and a high ground clearance frame with crankcase shield, and stripping it down to the bare essentials in case of off-road action, this military version of the 16H was capable of taking all the abuse that a rider or a terrain could throw at it. The buffer stops on the forks and the lower overall gearing enabled the rider to travel across smooth or rough ground with equal power and balance. Up to 100,000 of these military 16H machines were delivered and used during the entirety of the Second World War, which started in 1939 and ended in 1945. The military 16H motorcycles were painted in accordance with which branch of the military they were issued to. The Army had olive green or khaki. The Royal Air Force had light blue paintwork, whereas the Navy had a deeper and darker blue. Some of the specially built and military-tested 16H machines even stayed in Army service well into the 1950s. Such was their ease for mechanics to maintain and for soldiers to master. The Norton 16H finally ceased production alongside all the other side-valve engine motorcycles in 1954. It had played a big part in the Second World War, and for that alone, it'll always be guaranteed a place in history. The Norton 500T Competition is a beautiful machine, with a look that combines classic roadster with classic off-roadster. It is essentially a trials motorbike, meaning that it was developed specifically for off-road riding. During the pre-war era of Norton manufacturing, these so-called trials bikes had only been available via mail order. For instance, the Colonial was one such bike, which had been developed by James Lansdowne Norton, the revered founder of the company, in the 1920s, after taking a riding holiday in South Africa. And it wasn't until the relatively late date of 1948 that such a machine was built and sold in the normal Norton range of motorcycles. This was the Norton 500T competition. In the post-World War II years, motorcycle trials became a very popular pastime. An entire generation of young men returned to civilian life after the constant adrenaline rush of war, and although they were undoubtedly glad to have survived, there was most definitely a void to be filled. Motorcycles offered great excitement, whether just for transportation, road racing, or on the trial circuits, and machines like this one were very highly prized indeed. The Norton 500T started out with the diamond frame from the Norton 16H, with the same road holder forks at the front. However, the wheelbase was reduced considerably by sharply raking these road holder forks to bring them in line with the steering column. The 490cc engine of the Norton Model 18 and subsequently the Norton ES2 was then fitted into this frame, with a crankcase shield bolted underneath it. The only difference here was that this refitted engine had a bi-metal alloy head and barrel to try and keep the weight of the bike down to a minimal 300 pounds. This was eventually achieved by making other parts of the motorcycle lighter in the initial construction, like the silencer, rear engine plates, mudguards, number plates, and a 7-inch front brake. This front brake was also fitted with a water-excluding ring in a scalloped hub, and the cast iron brake drum was drilled with large holes to help with the lightness issue. The work to make this 24 brake horsepower motorcycle a less heavy machine than the previous Nortons was also continued through to other aspects of the bike. Wheel rims were created from high tensile steel. A rubber saddle was used with alternative mountings to adjust the seat height, along with fully adjustable handlebars. This was a quick and easy bike that managed an excellent 24 brake horsepower at 5,300 revs per minute and was extremely popular with private owners. It also performed well as a trials machine, continuing the grand Norton tradition of reliability and success, with nothing much added to each subsequent model as each year went by. The odd part was replaced here and there with a lighter alloy version in order to make the 500T equivalent to someone on a continuous Weight Watchers diet, but it never became anorexic, lost its appetite, or ran out of energy. The pre-war style gearbox was never updated and remained firmly tucked in between the back of the crankcase and the rear wheel, fitted as it was with wide ratios and a folding kickstart lever. The only main feature added was the inclusion of the clutch from the perennially popular Norton Manx motorbike, which had performed so well on the racing circuit. It was still selling well and looking good when it disappeared, seemingly without reason, from the Norton catalogue in the September of 1953. The Norton 500T competition truly is a beautifully shaped motorbike, even by 21st century standards, with a ride that matched its aesthetic qualities. Packed all the punch of a heavyweight with the weigh-in of a featherweight. Norton never produced another trials bike after discontinuing this model, and the 500T competition was the last shining example of its kind. The Norton Commando was probably the best loved machine to come out of the last years of the British motorcycle industry. Hailed as the best and most famous parallel twin-engine bike of them all, it even won the Motorcycle News Machine of the Year competition 5 times in a row. It's easy to see why. The very first Commando was unveiled at the Earl's Court Show London in 1967 to a great reception. The sleek and strikingly original styling earned this Norton the name Fastback. The praise went to 2 development engineers, Bernard Hooper and Bob Trigg, helped by engineering director Dr. Stefan Bauer. They suggested that a conventional frame design was not aerodynamic enough and lacked good engineering principles. They also knew that the engine vibrations that had plagued earlier Norton twin-engine bikes would not be tolerated by a new generation of riders. Taking an existing 745cc engine from the Norton Atlas, they modified it to fit a radical new chassis by isolating the angled forward engine from the rider, as well as the transmission train and rear wheel. The engine was assembled together with the gearbox and swing arm as one unit. The twin cradle frame consisted of a large main spine plus twin down tubes, to which the engine became attached by means of adjustable rubber mounts at 3 calculated points. This was known as the isolastic system, and it allowed the motor to shake, rattle and roll with its 1950s origins, whilst keeping the late 1960s rider as peaceful and as laid back as the hippie doctrine of the time. 6 years after the initial success of the Commando 750 in 1973, the 745cc engine was bored out to produce a larger 850 Commando with a 4-stroke twin engine of 828ccs. This powerful bike looked just as good as it sounded, with a distinctive seat unit made of fiberglass. The sporty hump that dominated the rear, which earned it the nickname Fastback, gave the bike a racing line that echoed the success the previous model had achieved at the 1973 Formula 750 TT, with Peter Williams riding it. The Norton 850 Commando was available in a standard Roadster edition and also a large tanked interstate version. This was so it could appeal to the speedy individual who wanted to tear around the countryside as if he were Peter Williams, and the more sedate rider who enjoyed the long-distance touring of the same countryside with an eye on an enjoyable ride rather than a full-out race. The Commando 850 is one of the few British twin-engine machines that could accelerate from 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds, which was revolutionary in its day, and the top speed was a blistering 120 miles per hour when you moved quickly through the 4-speed gearbox. Masses of torque could thrust the light and narrow chassis forwards in an exhilarating and breathtaking manner. The electronic ignition starter was introduced to the 850 Commando 2 years later, but by that time, the British twin-engine machine was already showing its age, especially in comparison to the newer designs flooding the home market from the Japanese sector. The Commando 850 was the last public motorcycle made by Norton before the company went into enforced liquidation, churning out the last few of these mean machines in 1978. Many people have wondered how this could have happened when the Commando was top of its field and such a successful bike, but the climate was changing. Norton continued low-key development of a motorbike designed and built specifically for several British police forces with a rotary engine over the next 10 years. But nothing matched the speed, grace and power of the Norton Commando. Since its untimely demise, interest has risen again in this classic bike, and enthusiasts will pick up a Commando 850 nowadays, as opposed to a similar Japanese bike, and spend every available weekend rebuilding their Commandos to match specific production design. The practicality and definite character of these classic British bikes make them, even now, a cut above the competition. As surprising in attack and using as much stealth in its quiet nature, the Commando deserves to be named after the soldier of the same name. It's well trained, dangerous to provoke, and fights to the end with every last drop of energy and strength. Commando by name, Commando by nature. As this great celebration of Norton motorcycles draws to a close, the latter years of the company's history, like the British motorcycle industry in general, failed to produce a happy ending. In the post-World War II years, there were some excellent new models to come out of Norton. Initially, the H16 and similar pre-war machines were the order of the day. But with Bert Hopwood and Joe Craig on board from 1946 onwards, the OHV Vertical Twins, OHC development, and Manx racing bikes proved very successful. Another huge advance was made in the 1950s, when brothers Rex and Cromie McCandless designed Norton's classic featherbed frame. From 1953, the addition of swinging fork rear suspension improved matters even further, as Norton enjoyed an enviable reputation for producing top-notch motorcycles that were both fast on the racetrack and ideal for everyday motoring. Nevertheless, despite design innovation, by the 1950s Norton had run into financial difficulties, and in 1953 was bought by Associated Motorcycles, manufacturers of AJS and Matchless. This amalgamation of British motorcycle companies did, to a point, make financial sense. However, when such great marques were all grouped together where one struggled, they all faced disaster. Also, AMC failed to capitalise on the assets that they had, and this was the beginning of the end for Norton. During the 1960s, Norton left their Birmingham roots behind, with production transferred to AMC's London factory. When AMC collapsed in 1966, it was taken over by Manganese Bronze Holdings, when the Norton name was promoted as Norton Villiers, and then finally Norton Villiers Triumph. Sadly, this was all to no avail, as the group went bankrupt in 1977. Thankfully, quality will always win the day, and due to the hard work and commitment of classic motorcycle enthusiasts, the Norton heritage lives on. The wonderfully evocative names of the Dominator, Commando, and the International have been kept alive by collectors all over the world for future generations of Norton riders, and, as you've seen demonstrated throughout this programme, not under glass cases in museums. These motorcycles are ridden on a daily basis, used for the purpose for which they were designed all those years ago. It's also interesting to note that the Nortons tend to be very popular with the ladies who ride classic motorcycles, of whom there are a pleasingly high number. The golden age of the British motorcycle might be long gone, but one thing's absolutely for certain: the classic Norton motorcycles will never be forgotten.